Hi, in this video I'm going to try and give you an overview of the various steps that you go through in writing a scientific manuscript, a scientific paper, and it's been known for quite some time that the writing process can be divided into three major steps. The first step is, or phases we might say, the first phase is the pre-writing phase, that is preparing all your materials for the actual writing process. Writing proper, that's when you put pen to paper, when you actually write up your manuscript. And the revision process, that is the editing process where you correct mistakes in your first draft, polish your text, generally make it more readable. I'm also going to look at article sections, and we're not going to use the traditional order here. We'll turn this order around a little bit and start with results, because you usually get your results from your tables and figures after you've prepared your tables and figures. So these should be relatively easy to present. And then we move on to the methods section. After that, the introduction and the discussion section. So let's first ask ourselves what kind of animal a scientific manuscript, a scientific paper is. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about a lengthy paper like a dissertation or a shorter paper like a journal article. A scientific manuscript is basically a text that reports on research that has been completed, and it usually has a well-known format. I've already hinted at that in the outline. It follows the introduction, methods, results, discussion format, usually in that order. Sometimes there may also be a conclusion. That depends, for example, on the specific journal you're targeting, the journal you're writing for. Now, in the English tradition, research papers follow a number of conventions, and these conventions, which we'll look at in more detail later, are writer responsibility. So the writer is responsible for the clarity of his or her text. As a writer, you need to make sure that your text is as easy as possible to process for the reader. So you should produce your text in such a way that it tends to be easy on the reader. Linearity, that's a second point. So English texts tend to be fully linear. One point follows logically from the preceding one, which is not always the case in German texts, or texts from Arabic countries, for instance, people with an Arabic background whose texts tend to be circular, or what we call point late. So English texts make their points early and in a linear way, whereas Germans, for instance, or writers from other countries tend to write in a non-linear way. So that's also something that has to be learned to a certain extent. And it also means a particular tradition in paragraphing, in creating paragraphs. Again, we're going to talk about this in more detail later, but very briefly, what this means is that in English we have a topic sentence or a point sentence that starts the paragraph, and there's a central idea in this point sentence. It makes the point of the paragraph, if you like, and all the other sentences refer back to this central idea in the point sentence or the topic sentence. So we can already see that a scientific paper is also an argued text. It doesn't just present information, it also takes a stance on it. It expresses a particular view on the information given, especially, of course, in the discussion section. And it tries to add to the body of scientific information that's currently available. So it tries to improve on what's already there. A very basic thing to do when you, or rather before you start writing, very basic thing to do in the planning process is to think about time management. So is there a specific due date when you have to hand in your paper? And you would then need to start a countdown to that due date. There are lots of planners available on the internet. This is one example taken from an American university library, and you get these assignment calculators that will tell you how to or when to do what, basically. Of course, they won't tell you when to do what. You have to fill that in for yourselves. But the assignment calculator will then remind you later if you're still on schedule. So those are very helpful tools. So as I was saying earlier, it's been known from research since about the 1980s that the writing process falls into three rather distinct phases, which are closely interwoven, especially with experienced writers, but still you shouldn't convolute them if possible. Try to keep them apart. That's important. And the first of these phases or steps is pre-writing. So writing starts with this pre-writing phase, and that's when you're collecting, organizing and synthesizing your facts, your data, all the information that's going to go into your story or manuscript. By the way, the term story, I use that rather loosely, as is often done in English, to mean a narrative, a research story. So you can also think of your research as a story, of course. You start with an experiment, for instance, and then something goes wrong. Obviously, you won't mention that normally in your story, but you can see how it can be conceptualized as a story. You work out some take-home messages. You figure out the flow of the ideas and the organization of the ideas, and that's a step you shouldn't skip over. Some people think that it's more efficient to just jump right into the writing and work out what they're trying to say as they go along. That's not a good idea, I think. So don't do pre-writing and writing at the same time. That's usually inefficient. So it's important to get all your information at your fingertips, organize it in some way, and lay out what's going into your paper ahead of time before you open your word processor. Because otherwise you'll end up losing the big picture of your story if every time you open your word processor and then you write your first sentence and then you realize you need a specific statistic that's in a specific paper, but you haven't got the statistics, so you need to toggle over to some website and try to find the paper and so on, and you can't find it, so you go to Google and find it there, and so on. this is a very inefficient way to write because you're not actually doing any writing, you're just fishing around for information. So get organized before you put pen to paper, or rather finger to keyboard these days. In those rare cases where you have no idea or only a rough idea of what you're going to write about, the following tips may come in handy. You could start by reading a general article in an encyclopedia, for instance, the Encyclopedia Britannica. Read recommended readings recommended by your lecturer or professor. Use the library, of course, use the electronic library. And what's very important, and even advanced learners, advanced writers tend to forget this, is to read smartly. So to perhaps read only first paragraphs, last paragraphs, first sentences, indexes, introductions and conclusions, forewords, and so on, rather than entire articles or entire books. So try to focus on the information you really need. And then note down ideas and try to connect them in a sensible way, and this will help you to limit your subject. You can also use free writing as a technique, of course. Just I was just suggesting that basically don't interrupt the writing process. That's free writing. Just put down anything that comes to mind, and also engage in brainstorming sessions, use diagrams to order your thoughts, and so on. These are some very basic tips. So before you actually sit down to write, you need to have a rough idea of what your paper, what the structure of your paper is going to look like. In other words, you need an outline that lays out the sections. These will usually be clear anyway, introduction, methods, and so on, but also the subsections of your paper. And you will need well, bits and pieces of information that form the core matter of each paragraph in a particular section. The interesting thing about pre-writing is that it can be done away from the computer also. So it can be done while you're jogging, while you're working out in the gym, and so on. All you need is a little tape recorder, and you can just talk out sections of your text or ideas into the tape recorder, and later you write them down when you get home. Tape recorder is not necessarily needed anyway these days. You can also use your mobile phone for that. So our mind tends to wander when we go for a walk in the park or go for a walk in the woods, and makes new connections, and we get new ideas, and all of these can be scribbled down on a scrap of paper, or talked into your mobile phone. So all of that time can be used productively to help you get on with your writing project. Finally, pre-writing is about organization, so I want to give you some tips for organizing your paper. Part of this organization will be automatic because you'll be following the classic IMRD structure, so that's the highest level of organization. One level further down, we're looking at paragraphs, and this is a topic we'll be dealing with at some length tomorrow, but I'd just like to say a few words about paragraphs now. What may seem obvious here is that birds of a feather flock together, as they say, or in other words, similar ideas should be grouped together. So if you've got quite a few paragraphs talking about the same thing, they should all be collapsed into a single paragraph, or at least the paragraphs should be next to each other. And if the same topic is discussed in multiple paragraphs that are scattered across the paper, that usually makes things difficult for the reader. Another thing is when you're discussing academic debates, as is often done in scientific papers, and you're trying to sketch out your own position. A common mistake that beginning writers commit here is to present argument A, then the counter argument to A, then argument B, the counter argument to B, and so on. A better way to do this is to put all of the pro arguments first, and then all of the counter arguments, and then you can perhaps disprove all the counter arguments. That's much easier for the reader to process. We're now going to talk about the actual writing process. So you've done all your pre-writing. You've no longer got a blank Word document, but a document that's already filled with lots of interesting pieces of information. So you don't have to start from scratch. The important thing in this phase is not to get bogged down in detail. So don't be a perfectionist in this phase, but rather engage in what's called free writing. Try to put down to get down your main ideas in complete sentences and in a logical order. Try to focus on your take-home messages. Organize things logically if possible. Don't worry too much about the syntax or the correct wordings, the correct collocations, that is word combinations, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. It's important just to get a logically organized text at this stage that is not too muddled or too difficult to understand, and you can still deal with small details at sentence level at a later stage, the revision stage, which we're also going to look at later. So the important point, don't be a perfectionist. Elegance is not necessarily called for at this stage. So let's talk a little bit about revision. Revisions should be mainly sentence level editing if you've followed my advice about pre-writing and writing proper, because you've already got a logically organized text, at least in theory. Should you feel that your text is not logically organized yet, if there are indications that this is not the case, then it's a good idea to tag each paragraph, because this is the macro level of your text, the paragraphs and the sections, but mainly the paragraphs. Give them a label or tag them, and see whether certain labels repeat themselves. If that is the case, then you probably need to move those paragraphs closer together, and this will improve the logical flow of your text. But theoretically, if you've paid enough attention to the logical flow of your ideas during the actual writing process, this shouldn't be necessary, and you can focus on such things as finding strong verbs or getting rid of too much clutter in the revision process, which is something we'll discuss when we discuss revision in more detail. Generally, it's a good idea to read out your text aloud or have it read to you by someone else, because this will point out to you the things that are awkward, things that are repeated perhaps, or things that you simply can't understand any longer, although you wrote them yourself, just to just a few hours ago, perhaps. And well, obviously this will show you where things have gone wrong and passages that need improvement. So either talk your text into your mobile phone and then replay it to you, or have it read to you by a friend, preferably someone who's also more or less familiar with the subject. It's always a good idea when revising your text to have a checklist for mistakes. The best thing to do is to read your text several times, and each time focus on just one or two perhaps features of grammar, vocabulary, paragraph, or text organization. This checklist has been adapted from Veronica Smith and Christine Klein-Braley, in other words, Arbeitsbuchübersetzung. And it's a mnemonic, so something that can be easily remembered. Data password. The D stands for determiners. So look at the zero article, for instance, versus the definite article. Agreement, subject-verb agreement. Does the verb agree with the subject? Are pronouns and possessives used correctly? Tenses, have I used the present perfect correctly, or should I have used the past tense? Aspect, simple versus progressive form. Prepositions, passive versus active. Is the passive voice really necessary? Sequence of tenses. In any grammar you'll find boxes on reported speech and if clauses, for instance. Structures, so verb patterns and clause combining. These are things we'll learn more about tomorrow. Word order, subject, verb, object. But sometimes there are also exceptions, so inversion after restrictive adverbs, for instance, starting a sentence with only, and this means you have to turn around the word order, the usual word order. Only then did they realize. Orthography, that's spelling and punctuation. Real English, collocations should be authentic, so from dictionaries or other texts. That's also something we're going to talk about tomorrow. And do insertion. What does this mean? Not what means this, but I think that's obvious at your stage. So now for the different sections of scientific manuscripts, and here my recommendation would be to write them in a particular order, and I also specify this order in my book, Wissenschaftliche Texte auf Englisch schreiben. I think you should start with results, and before that you should have all your tables and figures ready, because they really tell the story of your manuscript, and you can extract results from tables and figures, of course. So when you have your tables and figures ready, write the results section first, and the results section will just give a summary of each table and figure, and is fairly easy to write. Next, I suggest writing the introduction, because that helps you to frame your entire paper. Then you can write the methods section, which is also fairly easy to write. The most difficult bit will be the last section, and that's the discussion section. It involves a lot of writing, of course, and therefore is the most complex section. The penultimate section to write is the abstract, because Writing an abstract just means gathering information from all the other sections and shortening that information so it fits into a particular word limit, say a 200-word abstract. So it's basically an abstract as a mini article that summarizes each of the sections that you've already written, so that will be easy to write at that stage. And finally, you need to give your paper a title. So we'll also look at titles. So the first thing you need is a complete set of tables and figures that tells your research story clearly and concisely. And then you can move on to writing up the results section. The results section will follow logically from your tables and figures. One common mistake that people make with the results section is that because it follows logically from the tables and figures, they tend to just reiterate line by line what's already in the tables. So it just basically becomes a reading out of what's already in the tables, but clearly that's not the point of the results section. You need to summarize at a higher level what's in the tables and figures. So point out correlations, describe trends, and just refer the reader to the tables and figures that provide the supporting detail. The introduction is actually fairly easy to write, and it's a fairly short piece of text usually. It may only consist of as few as 3 paragraphs. You start your introduction by answering what I call the what question. So you establish a research territory in which you show that the general research area is important in some way, although this is optional in some disciplines. But what you definitely need to do in this first paragraph is to introduce and review items of previous research in the area. Now you need to resist the temptation to mention all the secondary literature here. It's normal to introduce references to other works only where they are pertinent to the ongoing argument. So keep it short. The second paragraph is about establishing a niche for yourself. So you pinpoint for your reader the gaps and limitation of all the previous research about your topic. Then you raise a question about it, or you extend previous knowledge in some way. The third paragraph is about the how. You tell your readers how you're going to occupy the niche which you've just established, and you outline the purposes of the present research. And you may also announce principal findings at this stage. This is desirable, but again optional, and indicate the structure of the article. So there may be an organizational paragraph as well. Again, this is desirable, but optional. So you may end up with just 3 paragraphs for your introduction. Another optional element is to make some additional statements that give a positive value or justification for carrying out your study. Now for the methods section. Think of the methods section as a sort of cooking recipe for your study. The methods section provides sufficient information for the readers so that the reader or someone else could theoretically replicate the study. It makes your study repeatable, so you want to be fairly detailed in your description of the various steps that you went through. Now, this is especially important, of course, if you're using a new method, a new procedure, a new approach that no one else has used before. If you're using a well-tested or commonly used method, you don't need to go into all the details. So the method section will tell people who maintained the records, what materials were used, when was what done, where were the records kept, and lots of other things. You can actually find a checklist in most of the renowned journals that will show you what needs to go into a specific methods section for a particular journal. So in many disciplines, the methods section will involve 3 steps. Step 1, how were the data collected? Where did the data come from? That's the first step. The second step would be a description of the methods used to measure variables. And the third step would be the procedures used for analyzing your data. So that's a sort of tripartite procedure that can be used in many disciplines, and that's an easy roadmap to follow. So I'm now going to talk about the discussion section, the final section usually, although there may also be a conclusion, but very often the conclusion these days is part of the discussion. So the discussion section gives you a lot of freedom compared to the other section. It's not as fixed as the other sections, so it offers you an opportunity to write well, to put good writing on display, if you like. Of course, there's a lot of flexibility, and this may be a bit daunting then for the beginner especially. So we're going to talk about a lot of rules for good writing, and these will be especially important to remember when writing the discussion section. Now, the discussion starts by trying to answer the question that you ended up asking at the end of the introduction. So it basically tries to answer the research question. So you start with the most narrow piece of information, and then you broaden that out, and you try to support your answer with your own data or with facts and data that you cull from the literature. And you also say how your results fit into the broader picture of the literature. So basically the discussion section is about presenting your key results, putting them in context, in the broader context of your research area, and stressing what is important about your results, why your study matters in this particular context. That's why you need to have at least one strong conclusive paragraph, a strong conclusion at the end of your discussion, which presents what some people call the take-home message, the central message of your article, and it needs to state that with conclusive force. So before concluding, let me just talk about some minor points, some minor tips that may come in useful at all the stages of the writing process, basically. Try to use as many linguistic and other resources on your computer as possible, especially at the revision stage. So spell checkers, grammar checkers, the word count, of course, is important for journal articles. We're going to talk about such aids as thesauri, that is dictionaries of synonyms and monolingual learners dictionaries tomorrow, as well as corpora, such as the Sketch Engine, or the British National Corpus, or the COCA Corpus. You need a style guide, such as the European Commission style guide. And some people will also want to use reference management software such as EndNote or Zotero. To be able to back up what you say with evidence, which is of course very important, you need to keep accurate references as you do your research or take notes. Any information you quote needs to be put in quotation marks, and of course you shouldn't plagiarize or buy papers. Now, ideally, you should link each secondary work that you read with a point in your outline and note down carefully all the documentary information about each source, which you will later need for your bibliography. And of course, using reference management software makes that a lot easier. So note down the full names of all authors and or editors, the full title and subtitle of the work cited, the place of publication and the name of the publisher, and the year of publication. Now, very often the question crops up whether one should quote or when to quote. Quotation is essential for an academic text, but it should always remain subservient to the argument of that text. So you should only quote data that is crucial for your own argument. Direct quotation should be used very sparingly. It's usually used when you disagree with another scholar and you want to refute his or her point. And of course, there should be no quotation without subsequent discussion. So here's an example of a quote, of a quotation technique from one of my own articles where I quote someone, an opponent, basically right at the beginning of my article, because the rest of the article will be a rebuttal of the point that he makes here. I'll just read this out to you, and this will show you how to use a quote that is then rebutted. Lexicography, more especially French lexicography, has traditionally relied on models of good usage, and there seems to have been a tacit understanding that, as Hanks puts it, a corpus of carefully written, edited and published texts is a better source of data than a corpus containing spoken data, which may show traces of speakers struggling towards successful encoding of their thoughts and interactions, relying on the conventions of their language, but it doesn't provide very good evidence for the conventions themselves. The present article takes issue with such claims, arguing that lexicography should provide a faithful record of all uses of a language. So I immediately announce what I'm going to do in this article. The whole article is going to be about the refutation of this claim. Now, it may sometimes be a good idea to, as was also the case in the excerpt which I've just shown you, to integrate the quote into the syntax of a larger sentence. That makes it more integrated. It makes it flow more smoothly. Makes the text flow more smoothly. Neumeier claims that all the distributional peculiarities of there follow from the lexical semantics of there and the pragmatics of its use. Carlson defends the position that the natural world is essentially aesthetically good, or as Kanagana-Yarkam points out, each essay is imbued with a deep awareness of the fluidity of margins. You would also tend to use different verbs depending on whether you agree with another author or whether you disagree with him or her. So for agreement, you tend to use words like emphasize, make clear, agree, acknowledge, point out, report or mention. For disagreement, You'd prefer verbs like claim, argue, assert, allege, contend, state, suggest, postulate, or believe. Don't use prove, demonstrate, or show, because, as you know from Popper, proof is usually impossible in science. Of course, an alternative to quotation is paraphrase, and here you can also use introductory expressions, just as with quotations. So Smith's argument that will allow you space to disagree, and Smith's explanation that won't. And there are some additional examples here which are evaluative in nature. Smith's surprisingly Freudian argument that, or Smith's cogent and convincing explanation that. Now, if the quotation is more than 3 full lines in length, then don't integrate it, but present it without quotation marks, indented, and optionally, if the journal allows that, in a smaller typeface, and preceded and followed by a blank line, as you can see in this example. Finally, you'll need to think about your title, and there are various frames that you can use for your title. For instance, well, I called it a frame now, and I'm using the word Rahmen here in German as well to as a subordinate term. What I mean is a general schema that you can use, and one of those schemas is frame theme, for instance, and you get titles like Parsing and Discourse, Context Effects and Their Limits, or The Elegant Universe, Superstrings, Hidden Dimensions, and the Quest for the Ultimate Theory, or Antibody-Directed Enzyme Prodrug Therapy, Efficacy and Mechanism of Action in Colorectal Carcinoma. A second schema is a theme frame, so the other way around, but of course you then need a preposition to link the two. So for instance, clause organization in the scientific journal article, or relationship of walking to mortality among US adults with diabetes, or rotation and asymmetry of the mitotic spindle direct asymmetric cell division in the developing central nervous system. A third option is to use frame plus and plus frame, Isaac Newton and Augustine Anglo-Latin poetry, or breastfeeding and the use of human milk, or frame plus and plus frame theme, technology and economic development, the dynamics of local, regional and national change, or theme method. Laparoscopic versus open gastric bypass, a randomized study of outcomes, quality of life and costs. Apart from that, there are a few other options. Sometimes these days you get questions, but few journals accept that as standard practice.